Hey, welcome back to Reliable Sources. Who do you believe, the president or the press? Sometimes it seems things really are that bitterly divided. We were talking earlier about Trump's frequent fake news slurs. This week he used a new term for TV shows he doesn't like, fake news hate shows. So let's analyze the effects of this rhetoric. This is Gallup data. Notice the red and blue lines here. Democrats' trust and confidence in the media has jumped up this year from 51% in 2016 to 72% this year. But you'll see the red line has fallen even further down. Now let's look at the overall percentage of trust in the media. When you take those two lines, you merge them together, you see there has been an overall uptick in trust in the media. But the number is still low, and the uptick is only thanks to Democrats. For more on this, let me bring in S.E. Cupp. She's the host of Unfiltered on HLN. S.E., I have a feeling it doesn't surprise you that Democrats' trust in the press has spiked up this year.
No, not at all, as the media has collectively taken Donald Trump to task and focuses often and frequently on his errors, his inaccuracies, and in some corners really demonize him and some of his policies. It's no surprise that Democrats are trusting the press more than they had in the past, and equally no surprise that Republicans are increasingly skeptical. Now, Republicans have always been skeptical of the media writ large, the mainstream media, as they like to say, and for good reason. The mainstream media has been largely liberal for a long time. Now, of course, you and I know the rise of Fox News has sort of put a dent in that argument, because conservatives certainly have a huge platform and position and a big microphone through Fox News and conservative radio, conservative digital. I mean, conservatives get heard, and they are compensated well for their media appearances and their media jobs. But there still is an overall impression that the media is a liberal place, and frankly, I think that the Trump presidency has really sort of sharpened that into focus for a lot of conservatives.
10 years ago, it was Sarah Palin calling the press the lamestream media, right? The liberal lamestream media. Now Trump has all these various insults that he uses against the media. Do you think that it has had a corrosive effect this year?
I do. Look, you know, I was talking to Cokie Roberts, a veteran journalist, about this recently, and she said, look, the media doesn't need to be popular. That's not our job. And so we shouldn't necessarily worry about popularity or our approval in the polls. But the poll that you talked about is trust, and that should matter to the media. So when Donald Trump villainizes the press writ large, that's dangerous. It's not dangerous because it hurts our feelings. It's not dangerous because people dislike us. It's dangerous because it undermines the real importance of this pillar of democracy, a strong, credible, free press. So, and he does it with lots of different institutions to try to undermine the trust in them, so that he is the only entity that is trusted by the public. It's a popular sort of dictator tactic, frankly, not to sound overly dramatic. It is what people do, but with particular attention to the press, he is really trying to erode trust, and it seems to be working.
You use the D word. I've been thinking about the A word, autocracy. There were a lot of concerns earlier in the year. I talked about them on this program, about whether we were seeing this authoritarian drift in the country led by Trump. And frankly, I don't know now, the end of the year, how much I agree with that or not. What's your take?
Well, certainly when it comes to some in the media. I mean, I have watched a lot of conservative...
Meaning people talking about it?
No, meaning when you watch Fox News, for example, one of the hallmarks of an autocracy of authoritarians is having a press that is very friendly, and a press that
celebrating the dear leader.
That the ruler can go to, knowing he'll have a friendly audience, knowing he won't be challenged. And it's not just Fox News that has become a very too comfortable home for Donald Trump. I know plenty of conservative journalists whom I enjoyed and respected, who have really decided to sort of cover for the president. That's dangerous too. That's just as dangerous as liberal bias. It's just as dangerous as fake news. So, the hallmarks of autocracies and authoritarian regimes are not just on the side of the president, of Donald Trump, but you see that sometimes in the press as well.
Now, when programs like this one talk about authoritarianism or question the president's mental fitness, does that just cause further distrust in the press and just make the polarization even worse and worse and worse?
Well, look, we all have to shy away from the kind of hyperbole that the president himself uses. It's not responsible when he does it, but it's definitely not responsible when we do it. I think it's completely fair to have an analytical conversation about some of the normalizing of the way the president treats the press and vice versa, and how dangerous that might be. To point out where we see, hallmarks of authoritarianism, I think that's honest and fair. We don't have to, fret that America is going to become a dictatorship. We still have checks and balances. We are one of those checks and balances. But I think it's fair to pretend that all of this is normal, to pretend that that we can just sort of lay this administration over, an overlay over the last and sort of trace around the subtle differences. No, there's no way to do that. So I think we have to have honest, fair, challenging conversations without getting crazy and hysterical and hyperventilating about it.
Now, you're a conservative columnist, and yet I remember you telling me offline that you even have members of your own family who think you're, traitor to the movement, not pro-Trump enough.
Yeah,
what kind of
fake
feedback
news.
do you get? Yeah, fake news.
Yeah.
So what happens around the table when you're at home for the holidays?
None of them mean it maliciously, but, we have some spirited debates. Look, I can handle it. You don't always want, the Twitter trolling to continue at home around the dinner table, but I can handle it. I've got thick skin. And, frankly, it's nice for me to check in with people who don't think like I do on this, because as well as I do in this building, a lot of people tend to see things in a certain way, both because we're in the media, we're in New York City, et cetera. So it's, I'm actually, it's nice to have a reminder of the way that I think a lot of people in the country are looking at the news, not necessarily the way that we do.
It's fun to go home. And by the way, in January, I saw you've booked Sean Spicer for January 4th?
Yes,
on your show?
for an hour.
How did you book him? He hasn't been on TV much since leaving the White House.
It's really organic. He tuned into SC Cupp Unfiltered one night on HLN. And I've known him for some time. And he texted me, he said, "Your show is great. I really love it. I love the format and the spirit. It's friendly, it's polite, it's civil, but it's interesting." And I said, "Great, come on. You know what? I'll clear the decks. You can come on for an hour. We'll talk about your last year, of course, and probably ask him some tough questions. But then let's move on and let's do that show where you get to ask some fun questions of some interesting guests, and we kind of get to do our own little thing for an hour. I think it's going to be really fun."
All right, January 4th, 5 p.m.
Tune in.
I'll be watching. Essie, thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Up next here, standing by in Washington, PolitiFact editor Angie Holan. She spent all year fact-checking so she could announce the lie of the year when we come back. Of this year has been the assault on truth. At the end of every year, I love going back and looking at what we covered and how, kind of like a self-evaluation. And when I went back and looked at January, our program from the weekend of Trump's inauguration was like a time capsule. I asked a bunch of questions pertaining to the Trump White House and the media. I asked, will President Trump deny reality on a daily basis? Will he make up his own false facts and fake stats? And if so, what are the consequences? Well, given the recent reports that he's questioned the authenticity of the Access Hollywood tape, I'd have to say yes, there is some denial of reality. Now, Trump's critics say a lot of this is ultimately about maybe his own insecurities, that he wants to project a winning image. That's why I think the single most inconvenient truth of the Trump era, the truth he can't escape, is from all the way back last year, November 8th, 2016. Losing the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, losing by millions of votes, contradicts all of the White House's claims about how the American people spoke and chose him so strongly. So for Trump, well, he opts for an alternate reality. One of the very first leaks of the year, one of the very first things sources anonymously told reporters, it was back on January 23rd, it was about how Trump had falsely told lawmakers that millions of illegal ballots had actually cost him the popular vote. Do you remember this? This was a big scandal. He was claiming 3 million people had voted illegally. Actually, Bill O'Reilly, of all people, asked him for proof.
So you think you're going to be proven correct in that statement?
Well, I think I already have. A lot of people have come out and said that I am correct.
Yeah, but the data has to show that 3 million illegals voted.
Forget that. Forget all of that.
Forget it, he said, and he changed the subject. But I don't think we should forget it. After all, this is part of the reason why the government set up a voter fraud commission. To this day, Trump continues to tout his electoral college victory. You know, during his first and only solo press conference in the White House back in February, he wrongly said he had the biggest electoral college landslide since Ronald Reagan. And there was this amazing moment where during the press conference, NBC's Peter Alexander had his phone out, he checked, he corrected the president, leading to this.
I guess my question is, why should Americans trust you when you accuse the information they receive of being fake when you're providing information that's...
Well, I don't know. I was given that information.
That's obviously not a good enough answer, but nearly a year later, Alexander's question still applies. Why should Americans trust you? Of course, that same question applies to all of us. So now my question for the panel is if truth was the biggest casualty of 2017. Still here at the table, Sally Busby, John Avlon, and Joanne Lippman. John, in this choose-your-own-news environment, do you think fact checks, do you think corrections, do they really break through?
They should. They're important. We need more fact checks in real time. We need more reality checks from anchors when people come on air and start spinning, and that applies to the president and the press secretary as well. You know, you asked, is truth the biggest casualty of 2017? I think that's the right term. It's wounded, but it's not dead. We need to keep fighting for truth because facts do matter, and we need to insist on it. And when we're confronted with spin, you know, what we're being confronted about the president's surrogates and staffers and the president himself goes well beyond the typical kind of spin and prevarication we've seen from previous presidents. There is unfortunately a steady stream of the fake stats and fake facts that you predicted the day before inauguration. And we need to confront that and not be afraid to call it out. And that, I think, in turn can help straighten America's civic backbone. It's a fight because the press's credibility is compromised as well. We do need to own that. But I think that's a result over decades of the rise of partisan media that President Trump has, if anything, accelerated and tried to capitalize on.
Looking at how the president's communicated with the public and with the press, obviously Twitter, a popular source for him. What about good old-fashioned interviews and press conferences? I mean, Sally, when's the last time the president spoke with the AP? We haven't seen a sit-down formal interview with, you know, you've got one of the biggest news organizations in the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that the president has sought out friendly interviewers. Other presidents have done that. It's been pretty intense this year, I think. And I think the public is, as John said, it's very divided in the news sources that it goes to. And so you can get away with, you know, quite a lot of that and of not answering sort of honest questions.
When you're talking about truth, though, I think we have to talk about a much larger context. This is not just talking about the presidency or the White House. We're talking about a year in the last couple of years where we have seen social media being weaponized by Russia and by other actors. I mean, Facebook acknowledged that 126 million of us, that's a third of the United States population, have been exposed to false reports posted by Russian actors and by others. And so that also degrades trust. It's really, this goes well beyond the White House.
It's designed to as well. I mean, that Russia's effort to influence the election via social media was classic disinformation campaign. It's designed to muddy the ground between fact and fiction. It's designed to sort of depress turnout and confuse people and demoralize people. And that's why it's so dangerous to democracy, which is why we've really got to forthrightly fight back. But it is, the fight is happening on multiple fronts right now. But it is a good fight. It is the good fight to defend democracy from this misinformation. But we should not take for granted the severity of it. Because it's happening from foreign actors, it's happening from the federal government, it's happening via social media.
Joanne, it's almost Christmas. Normally, presidents hold an end-of-the-year press conference. Does it matter that we haven't seen President Trump use that solo format that other presidents have in the past?
You know, the president's supporters and the rest of us hear from him very regularly. So typically that end-of-the-year press conference wraps up, is a chance for a president to talk about his achievements. President Trump talks directly with the population. So I would expect that, you know, we hear from him every day as it is.
Right, but we're not able to ask questions every day other than shouting them when he's walking to and from a helicopter.
And that's the way he likes it. I mean, you know, that's the argument. He views himself as sort of the way FDR used radio and JFK used TV. That's the way I use Twitter. But obviously,
when he has these safe spaces on Fox News, so when he does give interviews, at least basically since May, it's only been with Fox News.
That's right, and that's sort of, it's an extension of sort of the confirmation bias environment we're confronting in media, and I think that's also one of the real challenges, because we need to all box our way out of that. We need to figure out as journalists, I think, thinking in a deeper way about how to weaponize facts so they resonate as much as confirmation bias online.
I think the way he's used or not used media is really telling all year long. And think about it, you know, he decided not to fill out a March Madness bracket for ESPN. He skipped the Correspondents' Dinner. He skipped the Kennedy Center Honors. He hasn't gone on any late night shows or daytime talk shows. So it's more than, you know, just talking to Fox or avoiding press conferences. He's not using those kinds of entertainment outlets either to try to reach the population.
And yet at the same time, I think we've seen late night comics get much more topical and political to great effect.
And anti-Trump.
And anti-Trump. You know, the Colbert Show's resurgence, this has been in many ways the year of the Colbert Show, rocketing to the top of late night because he did not back away from politics. He did not talk down to the audience. He decided to get smart. You know, we saw, you know, John Oliver as well. Jimmy Kimmel getting very political about healthcare and personal in a way about his child. That really resonated. And I think that also speaks to the way you can talk outside any particular bubble.
Right, and people soak up information that way.
Right.
Panel, stick around. Much more after the break here. We're going to look at some data involving polarization, involving people in their own bubbles and silos. What can be done to burst our bubbles? To you and your family, it's time for Reliable Sources, our weekly look at the story behind the story, of how the media really works and how the news gets made. Today is a special edition, a chance to critically examine President Trump's relationship with the press at the one-year mark. Are alternative facts the new normal? Are partisan extremes here to stay? And what's the significance of all the leaks to news outlets this year? And later, it's the one end-of-the-year list that you don't want to end up on. PolitiFact's top editor is here to share the lie of the year. But first, I want to take you back in time. You know, so much has happened this year, it's easy to forget some of the shocking developments. For example, when you hear these words, are you still shocked?
I have a running war with the media. They are among the most dishonest human beings on earth.
That is how it began. On Trump's very first day waking up in the White House, he turned on the TV and he turned angry at what he saw. Journalists were pointing out that the audience for his inauguration was smaller than Obama's. So Trump fired back, exaggerating his crowd size and then sending Sean Spicer out to defend him. You know, Trump even described the inauguration weather inaccurately. He said the skies became really sunny after his speech, when in fact it remained cloudy and started to rain a little bit. I think that's actually a metaphor for the year. Trump painted a dark picture of American carnage and then said he alone could fix it. He believed his world was always sunny. When Trump played loose with the facts and journalists challenged him on that, he couldn't stand it. I mean, here's an example you've probably forgotten. This is from February.
The murder rate in our country is the highest it's been in 47 years, right? Did you know that? 47 years. I used to use that. I'd say that in a speech and everybody was surprised because the press doesn't tell it like it is. It wasn't to their advantage to say that.
It wasn't to our advantage to say that because it wasn't true. Obviously, fact checkers jumped into action, trying to counter the claim that he was making about the murder rate. But, you know, Trump's really cynical, sinister view of journalism that we don't really want to tell people the truth, it came through in his comments all year long. Here's another example.
Radical Islamic terrorists are determined to strike our homeland. It's gotten to a point where it's not even being reported. And in many cases, the very, very dishonest press doesn't want to report it. They have their reasons, and you understand that.
There he is telling members of the U.S. military that the press was intentionally downplaying, even covering up terrorist attacks. If anything, the opposite is true. All year long, I heard anchors and reporters and editors reaching for new ways to say that's not true and that makes no sense. And all year long, I heard the president coming up with new ways to call us the enemy.
We are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake. A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are.
That was February. Now let's fast forward all the way to August.
truly dishonest people in the media and the fake media. They make up stories. They have no sources in many cases. They say a source says there is no such thing, but they don't report the facts.
Some people have gotten numb to this, but these are really sinister claims from a world leader and totally unsupported by the real facts. I mean, heck, there were times this year that I used White House aides as anonymous sources because the aides would not speak on the record. Journalists don't go around making up sources. But look, the onus was and still is on us in the press to better explain why we do what we do. For example, why we agree to keep sources anonymous sometimes, how we vet our facts. Trump's daily media attacks have been a challenge and an opportunity. So when he says something like this,
it's frankly disgusting the way the press is able to write whatever they want to write, and people should look into it.
Yes, look into it. I think the more that you know about how newsrooms work, how journalists work, the more likely you are to know that it's not fake. Yes, one of the president's favorite words, fake. He told his supporters all year long that the press was out to get him, out to take him down. And many people believe it. The country is split on this question, and it's an ongoing issue for newsrooms. So let's bring in an all-star panel of decision makers and newsroom leaders. Sally Busby is the executive editor of the Associated Press. John Avlon's the editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast, as well as an analyst here at CNN. And Joanne Lippman is the chief content officer for the USA Today Network and the editor of USA Today. She's also the author of the upcoming book, That's What She Said, What Men Need to Know, Women Need to Tell Them About Working Together. Let's talk about Trump's attacks on the media and journalists' responses. Sally, this is your first year as the top editor at the AP. But before that, of course, you've been at the AP for many years. Was this the most challenging year to be an editor?
This was a very challenging year. There's no question. Both the extent of the interest in the Trump story globally, and I think that's one thing that's very important. It's not just Americans who pay an enormous amount of attention to this. People all over the world pay attention to the Trump presidency. And it's been difficult to get factual information out of this administration. It's, I think, provided a lot of new challenges to reporters.
Yeah.
But it's also been such an important year, so important for the values that journalists hold dear, the importance of facts. And in some ways, it's been, although there have been a lot of challenges, it's been sort of a inspiring year in a way, in the sense that I personally believe that consumers of news are actually seeking out good journalism and actually understand its values. So for many of our journalists, there's been some affirmation this year, I think, too.
Joanne, are you seeing that as well in the traffic and the page views?
Well, certainly we're seeing there's a real interest in legitimate journalism. But I would also say I think one of the most important things within the media itself is to understand, is to not internalize what we're hearing. When we have attacks on the press from the president or anyone else, it's so important not to internalize that and to...
Well, let's be honest. That did happen sometimes, didn't it?
And it absolutely
did. People took it too personally.
Well, not just personally, but to take on the mantle of being the enemy, which the press is not. The press, our job is to shine a light in dark corners, to hold the powerful to account, no matter who the powerful are. And that's what we have to continue to do.
Marty Baron, the head of the Washington Post, said, we're not at war with the administration. We're at work. But John, do you think most people believe that we're not at war with Trump?
I hope so, because that is really fundamentally what's happening here. Look, we are a guarantor of liberty. We are not the enemy of the American people. The founding fathers built in the First Amendment as a check on power grabs to hold the power to account.
But you feel like you need to remind people of that nowadays, don't you?
Yes, I do. But I think also people are being reminded that they can't take democracy for granted, that the free press isn't free. And that itself has an invigorating effect that I think is actually the silver lining we can take from all these conflicts. Because this is sort of advanced civics people are experiencing in real time. A lot of the old certainties about liberal democracy that I think people assumed or believed was ascendant around the world inevitably are being pushed back, not just at home, but around the world. So this is a time for the free press to stand up, for citizens to stand up and get involved, because the alternative is too terrible to imagine.
Trump certainly has forced conversations about profound issues, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about the most important basic values that we all may share or not share. There's been stories this year about race and class and gender that have affected the White House. So in a way, he's enabled or encouraged some really important soul searching.
Yeah, it's the old. There must be a pony in here somewhere, and I think there are silver linings. I do think people are taking more civic responsibility, and I think you're seeing that even in subscription rates. People subscribing to newspapers, in joining and membership models that they hadn't before. They were taking for granted that news content was free, but now they're understanding that they need to stand up and support independent journalism. That scoops matter. That investigative journalism matters, because that's what really holds power to account. And there may be great controversy around this, and we are all beset by social media trolls, and it's a bit of a novelty to be attacked by the President of the United States and the press, for some journalists personally. But I think we have to remain invigorated by the challenges and not exhausted, and realize that we have a gift of the fact that our mission is clearer than ever right now.
Thinking back to January and February versus now, I think there was a lot more anxiety early in the year among journalists, a lot more uncertainty about what a Trump administration was going to mean. Is it fair to say, Sally, that the worst fears some journalists had have not actually been realized, meaning there have not been an explosion of libel lawsuits. The press has not been kicked out of the West Wing. The cameras are still on in the briefing room after a brief period when they were turned off. That maybe our worst fears have not been realized.
I mean, I do think that there is some truth to that. I think that we did not get kicked out of the White House. I do still have some concerns about, the Department of Justice has said that there are a lot of leaks investigations going on, for example. We have some indication that the Department of Justice is still looking at some ways to sort of potentially eliminate some of the protections that have guided reporters in legal fights and things like that. And a lot of that is still up in the open. I think there's also, frankly, a lot of journalists have actually kept their nose to the grindstone fairly well and chased facts. And I think that has been the best thing that has happened this year. Every time we get distracted into sort of what I would call not terribly important fights with the White House, it takes us away from our main mission, which is to go out there and find out what is actually going on. What is the impact of the policy changes that are being made? What is happening inside the White House? What is actually factually happening? And within our organization, we have tried to say, do not get distracted by some of these more, sensational, but not necessarily as important disputes that have been going on, and try to keep your focus on what is really happening in this administration and your duty to report that to
That's
people.
been the most important thing, I think, this year that I have repeated again and again to our newsrooms is we've got to keep our eye on the ball, on the issues that are important, on the president's actions, not simply on the president's tweets.
Yes.
A researcher found that since 2015, the now president has posted about 1,000 anti-media messages on Twitter. So it does pile up. It does have an effect. John, I think it's a poisonous thing that he's constantly calling real outlets fake news. But to some degree, that is also a distraction.
And look, it is absolutely our responsibility not to be distracted by things that are intended to be distractions, to focus on the facts of what actually impacts people, not just radioactive rhetoric. But the larger issue I think that we need to confront is something that is quite sinister, and the president is advocating, which is blurring the lines between fact and fiction. Fake news in the context of the 2016 campaign is something real. It's stories written with the intent to deceive. They're sometimes for profit, sometimes for propaganda, but they had an impact on the election via social media. For the president to try to take that term back and direct it at credible news outlets, places that are filled with imperfect human beings, but who do check facts, who do correct mistakes, who are pursuing truth every day.
But what about the perception that journalists are so sloppy, they're making mistakes all the time? I mean, John, if you watch Sean Hannity's show as often as I do, you must think that journalists are an evil species, constantly screwing up on purpose to hurt the president.
Right, and that would be false. But Sean Hannity lives in this sort of, glass throne someplace out in...
CNN did have 3 people resign because of an error. We've seen errors at other major news outlets as well. Brian Ross suspended this month.
And those are corrective. That is evidence of the fact that standards matter. And then when people make mistakes, they are, taken into account. I don't think, we should overcorrect because you're never going to please some folks. But look at also the source of the objections is an administration, unfortunately, led by a president who lies at an uncommon rate, even compared and especially compared to other presidents. So this disregard for truth got to flow both ways. is coming from the president, not from the press. And we need to remain steadfast in insisting on a fact-based debate, recognizing that everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. And we can fight on that ground.
Can I just add, though, on this whole concept of fake news? Now, this is something I think is very dangerous just as a meme. I've actually instituted a rule at USA Today and the USA Today Network, which is 109 local newspapers like the Detroit Free Press and the Arizona Republic. We don't use that phrase because it's not correct, right? There's false information, there's propaganda. We need to call it what it is. But again, by internalizing that phrase and repeating it ourselves, it's a real misnomer. It's not news.
Quick break here. Let's keep this going right after a quick commercial break. On the other side, we're going to look back at Inauguration Weekend. Some of the questions we had then and whether we have any answers now. Stay with us. We're just getting started.
No, but you had the interview of the year with Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State,
did not deny it. That's
who
right.
refused to deny it because he's not a liar.
So listen to what the former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, has to say about Vladimir Putin praising the president.
I think this past weekend is illustrative of what a great case officer Vladimir Putin is. He knows how to handle an asset, and that's what he's doing with the president.
The General Clapper clarified he meant that figuratively, not literally, but he means it in the sense that foreign leaders, and I think there's some validity to this, and not necessarily the most nefarious way necessarily, but the Japanese, for example, have figured out how to deal with President Trump. You compliment him, you flatter him, you work with him behind the scenes, you don't take a stand against him publicly. There's something to this.
Yeah, look, Donald Trump is not a complex man. I mean, I think that's fairly certain. But that really goes to your question to Nina. How have the Democrats blown this? Because they have gone out and driven Donald Trump into the arms of Republicans and conservatives. I mean, I'm sitting here a year into this term, stunned at all of the conservative things Donald Trump has been able to do. And it's because he's getting no quarter from the Democrats. The Democrats are just going after him hammer and tong, and he has no choice but to go and drive the conservative agenda and all the regulatory things he's done. I mean, this is an impressive lineup of things the Democrats are screaming about. The one chance, and they did. They had this. I forget what it was. Where Schumer and Pelosi did the short-term
over government funding. Yeah.
And Trump was talking right after that because they all said nice things about, oh, we should work together more. And they basically slammed the door on him. And he's now gone back into the arms of Republicans. So to answer Nina, you can complain about this tax. You can complain about everything. But you've blown this. You've blown the opportunity to work with this president.
I just think that's just ahistorical. It's counterfactual. It's false, Rick. The Democrats would gladly work with him if he had
Donald Trump is a conservative ideologue who actually wanted to do it.
No, he's an autocrat who is trying to enrich himself in office, and he's succeeding. The Republicans seem to want to help him with that, passing a tax bill that lines Trump's pockets. Democrats unwilling to do that. But the Democrats have done very well politically in the year of Trump. They won a landslide in Virginia. They swept maybe even the majority of the House of Delegates. So a huge landslide in New Jersey, much more blue state. And they won a Senate race in Alabama. Now, I know there was allegations of child molestation. It's probably not the best message
issue there. Yes.
But if you just explain it away like that, it's like when Scott Brown won the Senate seat in Massachusetts. All my Democrats said, oh, it's a one-off, it's no big deal. We then rolled into the worst landslide we'd ever had in a midterm. This is what's going to happen in 2018.
That was
a landslide, blue wave.
Substance that
do you think that a Democratic wave is coming?
One would hope. I mean, I saw a survey that said there are about 391 people in the queue to run for Congress in 2018 as Democrats. Now, if Democrats can't win with those odds, then something is definitely wrong. There is a wave coming, but this is really going to be about who can excite their base. I mean, things are happening now. What's reality today might not necessarily be reality tomorrow, but the Democrats are going to have to get out there and make the strongest case possible using this tax plan as one of those things. The CHIP program, I mean, for God's sake, how do you not 9 million children land, right there at the mercy of Republicans, and you don't say that we commit to come together for 9 million children in this country?
But I'd say one point on upcoming races, I think Donald Trump drama does cover up a lot of the internal strife going on within the Democratic Party right now. Yes, they have an 18-point generic ballot polling advantage, but man, are they really going to bet their races on running against Republicans on tax cuts? Are they going to depend on having a Roy Moore in every race? And if you look at the disruption that's going on the Democratic side, it gets undercovered in the news. But if they're going to resort to Antifa-like tactics, which do continue to go on, they continue to get arrests every day in the U.S. Capitol. They continue to break buildings. It's happening.
But you're sweeping all Democrats with a broad brush like that? No, there is not one Democrat that I know of that supports any type of physical violence whatsoever.
I saw an event by Tim Tebow get shut down this weekend. I've seen people take over a mic by Bernie Sanders. There's going to be more attention focusing back to that, and if you can't get your house in order, you don't have a chance of beating Trump.
I want to ask one final question of you two, which is, in the recent CNN poll, 66% of Americans say that they see the tax bill as doing more to benefit the wealthy than the middle class. This is a risk. Do you think ultimately it's going to pay off for Republicans?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I just saw something, a report that 89% of people in New Hampshire are getting the tax cut. I mean, you're going to start to see the truth come out about this bill. There's been a lot of, frankly, inaccurate reporting going on about what this does. You saw AT&T, Wells Fargo, a whole bunch of companies now coming forward and say, hey, by the way, we're raising our wages. We're giving bonuses. This will trickle through, and that will be the reality instead of the rhetoric that was leading.
But you also saw other corporations who are giving benefits to their tax holders at the expense of the workers. And shareholders, excuse me. But I gotta say, there is not one Democrat that I know of that believes in violence at any of these events.
But it does keep happening. It does keep happening.
There is a disruption in
Democrats.
Yep.
Right, that's right. But there's a disruption environment going on, Jake, in this country to really push the political elites to do something for the people, and that does not mean violence.
All right. Thanks one and all. Merry Christmas to everybody here. While President Trump enjoys the holidays at his resort in Florida, kids and adults can enjoy his robotic replica at Disney World's Hall of Presidents. What if Robot Trump got loose in the park and something went horribly wrong? That's the subject of this week's State of the Cartoon Union.
Resolution number 1, binge more. Join the Uncarrier and get 4 unlimited lines for only $40 each. Whoa. Plus,
welcome back to State of the Union. I'm Jake Tapper. President Trump brought his bombastic attacks from the campaign trail to the White House in 2017. One of his frequent targets, his predecessor, President Obama. And President Obama has been, of late, hitting back. He invoked Nazi Germany when talking about the current political environment. And President George W. Bush, who rarely spoke out during Obama's presidency, has also on occasion voiced his concerns about the current climate. Joining me now, close confidants of those two presidents, Mark McKinnon, former strategist for George W. Bush, and David Axelrod, former Obama senior advisor. Welcome to both of you. I want to start with a question for both of you. This has been a remarkable year, the first year in what's been the start of a very unconventional presidency. You both worked for the two previous presidents, Obama and Bush. David, let me start with you. In just the past few weeks, President Obama has been, I think it's fair to say, increasingly vocal in some of his criticisms of President Trump, not just about policy, but also about the tone and tenor. Recently, he even invoked Nazi Germany in reference to the current political climate. Does President Obama see a danger in the Trump presidency?
Well, look, I think that the big concern, elections happen and policies change, and that is democracy. But democracy also depends on sustaining our institutions. One of the things that President Obama most appreciated, and certainly I did, was how President Bush handled the transition from one presidency to the next, and the period after. We weren't particularly kind to President Bush in the campaign, but he kept his counsel as to what his views were after he left office. And what you see now is a president who delivers hammer blows again and again to fundamental institutions of our democracy and adds to cynicism about our democratic institutions. And I think that's what President Obama was speaking to, and President Bush has spoken to it as well. Policies change, views are different, that's part of the system, but our institutions have to be sustained, and that's something that this president doesn't always appreciate.
And Mark, your former boss, George W. Bush, did something unusual for him. He made comments in the wake of the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville that seemed in some ways to be a rebuke of President Trump. Take a listen.
Bigotry seems emboldened. Our politics seems more vulnerable to conspiracy theories and outright fabrication. We've seen nationalism distorted into nativism. We've forgotten the dynamism that immigration has always brought to America.
And since he left office, President Bush has really tried to stay out of politics. What is he thinking when he says something like that?
Well, you're right, Jake. He's been staying off the radar screen to his credit, I think. But I think this just testifies to how strongly he felt about that moment. You know, it's interesting, when you look at the speeches of George W. Bush in 1999 and Barack Obama in 2007, if you mixed them up and handed them to somebody, you couldn't tell which was which, because they both campaigned very strongly on the notion of changing the tone in Washington and had real respect for the institution of the White House. I mean, that's one thing that we've seen with Donald Trump, is that I think that both Barack Obama and George W. Bush worry about the institution of the White House itself and what's happening to it right now. And in a lot of ways, when it comes to tone and tenor of the White House, we've really kind of clawed our way to the bottom.
Let me ask you, the President Trump had an ambitious legislative agenda coming into office. So far, he's been able to deliver on only one major legislative victory, this tax bill. And there have been a string of high-profile failures along the way. The Republicans control Congress. They control the White House. Why do you think this president has had difficulties that President Obama didn't have with the Democratic Congress and President Bush didn't have with the Republican Congress?
Well, I was surprised that he didn't do what both Barack Obama and George W. Bush and most presidents do, which is find an issue where you can reach across the aisle, at least when you start your presidency. And that's why I thought that he might start with something like infrastructure. Instead, he went, right to the base, right to strip out Obamacare, and really, just poked a sharp stick in the eye of the Democrats. So the problem after that is that once that happened, the Democrats said, well, why should we want to work with you if that's the way you want to start this presidency? But I don't think we can underestimate, the tax bill is a big deal. It's a big win for the Republicans and for Donald Trump. And, they got it done before the end of the year and maybe rushed it through too quickly. Maybe we'll see that in the long run. But right now, at the end of the year, Republicans can say we have relative peace, we have relative prosperity, and for us, given the way things started out this year, we're happy to end on this note.
David, President Trump has made it his mission to unravel President Obama's legacy, including so many things you worked on, including Obamacare. He succeeded in repealing the individual mandate, removing the United States from the Paris Climate Accords, working to decertify the Iran deal. How does that look from the perspective of President Obama and people like you who worked closely with President Obama to get this agenda passed?
Jake, I'm always reluctant to speak of it in terms of the Obama legacy because it makes it personal to him, and these issues shouldn't be personal to him. They should be considered in the context of their impact on the country and their impact on people. So when you talk about striking the mandate in this bill, which the president touted as one of its great features, although he said he didn't want to talk about it until after it passed because he knew it wouldn't be popular. It wouldn't be popular because 13 million people will lose their health care, estimated, as a result of that. That's concerning. Talking about undermining the Iran agreement is concerning, not because it was an Obama legacy, but because it could be very destabilizing and lead us into a greater period of conflict. And so all of these policies have implications that are serious. But I just want to say, I am not one who says that the president hasn't been impactful because he hasn't been able to pass major legislation until this tax bill. This tax bill is incredibly impactful, and we'll see if it's impactful in a positive way. I have my views on that. But certainly the steps he's taken to withdraw America from, as you mentioned, Paris, environmental standards that have been rescinded, regulations, consumer regulations rescinded, financial oversight regulations undermined. These are big things, the appointments he's making to the courts. These may please some in his base, but they have long-term implications. Those are the things that should be concerning to people, not anyone's legacy.
A recent CNN poll found that President Trump's approval rating was at 35%. I want you both to take a look at this list of presidential approval ratings through December of their first year in office. You'll notice that President Trump is at the very bottom. Bush, 2001, he was at 86%. Of course, that was after the 9/11 attacks. Obama, 2009, was at 54%. Mark, what do you think is the reason why President Trump is so low on that list?
Well, it's been a chaotic year, and Donald Trump has governed largely to his base. So he's governed directly, and that base is about 35%.
Hey, why doesn't he show his birth certificate? Genimo, CNN.
God bless Trumpy Bear.
New York.